Thanks everyone for coming tonight. My name is Jennifer Jett I'm Jennifer Jett from NBC News. I'm a correspondent governor here at the FCC and your moderator tonight. Thank you all again for coming. Before we get started, just a couple of quick things. One, please be sure to silence your phones if you haven't already. And also, I wanted to let you know about another event we have coming up next week. It's a club lunch on, I believe it's Tuesday the 3rd. Tuesday the 3rd, featuring Henry Litton, the former permanent judge of the Court of Final Appeal. This is an event that was supposed to be held earlier, a few months back, and it was postponed. So we'll finally get to hear from him. Please do sign up for that if you're interested. That's a lunch rather than a dinner on February 3rd. But for tonight, we are here to talk about everything going on in the world. I know it's a lot, which is why we're doing it at night, to give us a bit more time for discussion and also for audience Q&A. So please do think about things you want to ask about, because we have a very distinguished panel of speakers here who are able to shed light on a number of topics. So I will introduce them now. Starting on my right, we have Wang Xiangwei, who is a veteran journalist and seasoned China watcher who contributes extensively to the SCMP and other Asian publications covering Hong Kong, China, and their global relations. Since January 2023, he has been an associate professor of practice at Hong Kong Baptist University, and he also spent 26 years at SCMP, including as editor-in-chief from 2012 to 2016. Next, we have Michael Boserkue, who is an author, New York Times published opinion writer, global affairs analyst based in Ukraine, and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's a frequent media commentator and the founder of World Briefing, a widely read geopolitical report on Substack. Be sure to check it out. And he also worked previously at the South China Morning Post, Eastern Express, and Asia Times. And finally, we have Barbara Fernandez-Mayeda, who is assistant professor in Latin American Studies at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at HKU. Her research focuses on contemporary Chilean literature and culture, and her recent work also explores Sino-Latin American cultural relations, especially Chilean writers' engagement with China. She's also a contributor to media on Latin American current affairs. So, a lot to talk about. We'll start with the event that kicked off this year, which was Venezuela. So President Trump shocked the world on January 3rd with the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who is now awaiting trial in New York. The US raid, along with comments and threats by President Trump, has raised concerns that the sovereignty of other places, including Greenland and even Canada, could also now be at risk. What does this mean for the rules-based international order that has governed the world since the end of World War II? And what challenges or opportunities does this idea of the law of the jungle present for various governments? And Michael, let's maybe start with you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's good to be home at the FCC. One of the great things about speaking on a panel like this is you can't really prepare. You can basically throw away your notes from yesterday because everything changes so quickly. It's one of the pluses of doing a panel like this, but on the other hand, I think I speak on behalf of all of us, if I may, we feel like we can answer something, but we could very well be wrong. But having said that, I can answer this question both as a Canadian, born and raised, but also someone of Ukrainian descent, and as Jennifer said, now based in Ukraine. And like a lot of things right now, it's a very, very difficult time for both the leaders of Canada and Ukraine, and also, of course, the citizens. From the Canadian perspective, number one, look, I grew up, I became an adult years on Vancouver Island. Every morning we would wake up, we would see the United States. We breathe the same air, we breathe the same wildfire smoke. We feel the same earthquakes whenever they happen. We get their traffic on our radios. I had a US Customs and Border Patrol booth up the road from me. That's because we're a border town. So I think it was former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau who said, as a Canadian, living next to the United States is like a mouse living next to an elephant. You're sensitive to its every move and twitch. And indeed, that is how we felt for years. And we also, quite frankly, moved very much in lockstep with the United States. We really felt that, for example, during the COVID pandemic, our policies, whether it was on public health, but also on foreign policy, very much aligned. And of course, NORAD, we depended on a lot of our security umbrella on the United States. As a result of our history, our trade flows were for the longest time oriented north-south to the United States, especially, for example, sale of Alberta oil to the US. And now we're being forced to not only reorient our economic policy, but also of course, our political policy and move away from dependence on the United States. But as many other countries, for example, Ukraine and European countries are finding out, you can't do that overnight, especially if you've been very negligent in terms of military spending. On Ukraine, look, as we said, I just came from there, and one of the reasons I could come here at this time, and one of the reasons I left a few days earlier, is because in the span of 1 week, just a little bit of context, if I may, I had Russian drones right over my head, right over my apartment in the middle of the night. And it's one thing to hear drones from far away. It's one thing to hear explosions far away. But when they're right over your head and they're kamikaze-type drones that can fall anywhere, it's very, very scary. So that is why I've said on CNN and elsewhere, I've written in Substack, my newsletter, no inch of Ukraine is safe anymore. So to kind of end, President Zelensky knows very, very well that in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of military defense, very, very reliant still on the United States. And of course, Ukraine really felt that very, very profoundly when Trump temporarily suspended that without notice. And there's nowhere else really to look for, especially the intelligence sharing. And finally, one of the most important things being negotiated right now between Ukraine and Russia is security guarantees. And of course, I think we can all agree that the United States is the main provider for the time being of security guarantees, because at the end of the day, if you have a peace deal or a ceasefire and the Russians come back, which they almost certainly will, that puts the United States as the main guarantor on the hook for boots on the ground. And finally, as with Canada or Ukraine or whoever, even if President Trump signs with his crazy signature on the dotted line, you can't expect him anymore to honor that commitment, nor can we really expect a future administration to honor security guarantees. We all remember the 1980s, 1990s Budapest Memorandum. The US, UK, and Russia didn't come through in 2014 on the Budapest Memorandum.
And Barbara, moving on to you, the US attack on Venezuela, how has that affected the region, and what do you think this means going forward? How are they feeling about this intense US interest in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I normally get asked questions about how do people in Latin America feel about this or that, and it's an unfortunate question because I cannot say anything about that, because we cannot think of Latin America as a monolithic region. It's a region that exists geographically, but internally it's made of different countries with different histories and different political affiliations and different issues. So in regards to the impact and the opinions, one can say that there are some countries which are more leaning towards Donald Trump's administration. Let's say Argentina, mainly. If you ever saw President Milei with a chainsaw, presenting it to Elon Musk. My own country, Chile, elected right-wing president. He's starting in March. That's going to be very different from Gabriel Boric, moderate left. On the other hand, you have Colombia. Colombia have been a very close US ally for decades, especially in the war against drug trafficking, etc. But now their last government is left-leaning. But it tends to be a very moderate country, so this is a new situation in which there's been back and forth between President Petro and Donald Trump, and they're trying to cool down the relationship to make things work between the countries. And Venezuela is a strategic country. They have the largest oil reserves in the world. At the same time, President Maduro's legitimacy in power was under question. At the last election, he claimed he had won the election, but there were no results to be seen. So, and the opposition said that they knew that they had won it. So that's sort of an argument that someone may say, okay, so this is an illegitimate government. We could do something about that. But in my opinion, Venezuela issues have to be solved by Venezuelans. So what nobody talks about are the many victims of this invasion, if you can call it like that. Between 40 to 80 people died, and it's between Venezuelan residents, Cuban soldiers, Venezuelan soldiers. What was last week on the news, I don't know how updated people are on this, because everything, as you said, happens almost hourly, that you check the news and something else has happened, so it's like we cannot cope with so much going on. That is being uncovered that the action in Venezuela was orchestrated together with the acting president and her brother, the Rodriguez, so it's now called Rodriguismo. So that means that they wanted to make sure that President Maduro was ousted, but what happens with the government now? Opponents to Maduro or to Chavismo probably would like elections. And let's see if the elections are clean and we can have somebody else. But so far, it's been doing great for the Trump administration with Delcy Rodriguez. So maybe the Venezuelan opposition would be disappointed in the next coming days or months, because if the Trump administration gain what they want from this, which is oil, riches, and money, etc., there's no need for a democratic transition of power. So we really don't know. And the region is divided about this because of political, ideological affiliations. So it depends from where you look at it. But it doesn't look good in general, because it's like what you said in the questions, like this international context where all countries agree that there will be a certain balance and equilibrium, but now maybe somebody else can say, okay, so then I can do what I want.
Exactly.
What's anyone going to do about it? Is anyone supporting Venezuela other than doing some lip service? So I think it's a dangerous precedent, to say the least.
And Xiangwei, what other scenarios do you see coming up as a result of this? Or do you think there are governments in the world that are looking at this and saying, okay, well, maybe now I can do whatever I want?
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for having me. Let me offer this following observations. You know, this morning I went to this annual investor conference at the Four Seasons organized by Goldman Sachs. I was there for the past few years. Several years I was a speaker, and this morning I went there just as a member. And then this morning, the former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was speaking. And one of the things he said was that, which struck me, was very interesting, because I was at this conference over the past 5 years. In the previous 3 or 4 years, the investors, the people were talking about decoupling from China, the risks, the dangers, the benefits, the disadvantages. And at the stage this morning, Rishi was speaking about now every country is thinking about how to reduce dependence on the United States. That tells you how things have changed. The second point I want to offer is, I want to play a bit of a sort of devil's advocate. It seemed to me, as a Chinese, as someone who's studying China-US relations and international politics, is to me, whether you agree with Donald Trump or not, sort of Donald Trump has made it very clear what he wants for the United States and what he wants for the rest of the world to operate. And your Prime Minister, Mark Carney, made an excellent speech in Davos, suggesting the middle powers should unite, and other countries also made various comments. But I don't see a plan. I don't see a roadmap. And Trump has made it very clear, whether you agree with him or not, what he wants for the United States. He wants Greenland. He wants, he wants U.S. to focus on the Western Hemisphere, and he wants to get rid of, he's probably going to invade Iran and then Cuba. He made it very clear. And how the rest of the world is responding, except for complaining, calling for unity, there was no roadmap. That's the second observation, I want to offer. And as far as China is concerned, of course, if you follow the news regarding to China, a number of European prime ministers, the leaders of the governments, either have visited China or is on the way. So we have the Irish prime minister in China already, the Canadian prime minister, and now the Finnish prime minister is in China right now, to be followed by the British prime minister. So, if you ask for advice, if I could give advice for the Chinese government, the advice is to shut up, do nothing, and let Donald Trump do his own self-destructing performance. And then China can benefit a lot. But having said that, there were serious lessons for China to learn from what Trump has done over the past few weeks, month. First is that I'm not quite sure you read this piece of item. Just 3 or 4 hours before, US Special Forces plucked Maduro out of his bed. He met with China's Latin American envoy, and they exchanged gifts. And then according to the Venezuela media, that China's envoy was there to review 600 agreements with Venezuela. And China has promised to invest $6 billion in Venezuela. Even though now Trump, and that tells you, first of all, there was this massive intelligence failure by China's intelligence agencies, by China's foreign ministries about what is really happening in that part of the world. And secondly, even though Donald Trump has said he will allow Venezuela to sell the heavy oil, to sort of continue to sell the heavy oil to China. But there again, there was so much uncertainty over China's investments in Venezuela and in that part of the world. The third point I want to make is this, because Trump, it's very clear to everyone that Trump is bringing the law of jungle back to the world. I think, like rest of the countries, China now is reviewing its options, what China can do. And this is also something that I'm thinking a lot, because I'm going to write a column for SCMP. My monthly column, the deadline is up, so I'm going to give you a preview of what I'm going to write about. The first lesson China needs to learn is that China needs to adjust its Belt and Road Initiative. China needs to adjust its foreign investment priorities. What this means, because Trump may not be the president 3 years later, but the Trumpism will probably continue. And the US has made it very clear through its national priorities that US will focus on the Western Hemisphere. It happens China is investing heavily in that part of the world. I'm merely suggesting, isn't the time for China to review its Belt and Road Initiative since the law of jungle is now back. So shouldn't China consider that it should reduce or refrain from investing in the places where their military reach cannot cover? I think this is one of the things China should seriously consider. And if you follow that logic, shouldn't China invest more? Shouldn't China invest more in the neighboring countries? Try to repair its relationship with India. I'm not sure China is going to repair a relationship with Japan, but other countries, particularly, shouldn't China strengthen trade ties with ASEAN countries? And it happens that ASEAN is China's biggest trading partner, bigger than EU. So I think if you look at the second suggestion I want to make, it's going to be very controversial, is that if China, for China's current projects, shouldn't China, if China's military reach cannot cover in certain countries, shouldn't China sort of build up its own mercenary troops to protect their own investments? Let me give you an example. Pakistan is China's closest ally, but China's investments are constantly attacked, even in Pakistan. So I think I also have some other suggestions, but I'm not going to tell you all because you're not going to read my column. That's the initial thoughts I want to offer. Thank you.
Well, it could be like how Russian mercenaries protect diamond mines in Africa.
Yeah.
They have very forced projection there to
I
take
mean,
care of any trouble.
Yeah, I mean, because, the thing is, China is often make the most investments in a country run by a dictator. If that guy is deposed in Africa, and then China will have to deal with this all over again. I mean, particularly in Latin America, that now U.S. has made it very clear that's U.S. backyard. So how China is going to deal with it, I hope, the reason I'm writing this column is I hope the Chinese government should seriously consider, and reviewing its Belt and Road Initiative, something for them to think about and something for you guys to think about if you are interested in the geopolitics. Thank you.
May I say something?
Yeah.
Sure.
I really dislike when Latin America is discussed as a backyard. First of all, I don't like that at all. Apart from Venezuela, Cuba, El Salvador, I would say that in the southern cone at least, whether we like who's president or not, we have very healthy democracies. We have issues along the way, but in general, it's a peaceful region. You haven't heard of war there for a long time. There was a new port built very close to Lima in Peru, the Chancay port, which reduced the trading time by 2 weeks between China and South America. The mercenary idea, I find it very scary, I have to say, and I hope it doesn't happen. I hope no one gets excited about that. But even though the US may try to have sort of like a Cold War mentality about this and try to intervene like in the 70s and 80s with the Condor operation that they wanted to have control over the region, I don't think we're there right now. I think it's different. The US is showing itself as a very hostile country. And China has very good relationships with Latin American countries. Brazil is China's third largest business partner. So even though if there are changes in certain things and the US is trying to influence the countries in any way, I don't think Latin American countries will back down on the trade agreements with China. I think that would be a very, very difficult scenario. And we can decide for ourselves in that sense that if the US is becoming problematic, you can also trade with other people. And I think that also was the message when there was a meeting between Xi Jinping and the Latin American leaders in the CELAC. This was in May. I talked to you about this in May earlier. So there is this idea that if things don't go in the right direction for us, we can also choose to do business elsewhere. And actually, that's China's game right now.
Yes. Can I just respond to I think it's very interesting the point. I'm not suggesting that China should reduce its investments in Latin America. What I'm just saying that in future, when China look at its investment priorities, you need to invest in the places where they can protect. Because I was particularly struck by one comment you mentioned earlier in Venezuela. Now, who is supporting Venezuela? I mean, because after the United States plucked Maduro, and then China made big noises about condemning the United States, and then what else? So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not suggesting at all, I need to make this clear, otherwise I'll get myself into trouble. I'm not suggesting that China should reduce investment anywhere. What I'm saying is in future, when China plans its investments priorities, you need to invest in a place where it's military or they have the means to protect their investment. I mean, because whether we agree with this scenario or not, this law of jungle is back. And then you need to protect whatever you have. I mean, otherwise, it's like I mentioned earlier, China has committed $60 billion in Venezuela. Now China is acting at the mercy of the sort of Donald Trump to see whether China can continue to buy to get the oil China paid for from Venezuela. I mean that's the point I want to make. Thank you.
Staying on China, with everything that's been happening and remarks by President Trump and other members of his administration about the rules-based world order and their feelings about it, China has been presenting itself as the true defender of free trade, of that post-war international order. How successful do you think China will be in presenting itself as an alternative to US leadership, and where do you think US-China relations are headed this year?
Thank you. You want me to answer? Okay. Thank you. I think that's an excellent question, just following on what I have discussed. I want to make the following comments. First of all, that, what Trump has done over the past 1 year has certainly strengthened China's moral leadership as the champion of the global South. But exactly what China can do is a different matter. I mean, I can give you 2 examples. You see, Donald Trump claimed or boasted he ended 8 wars, right? Whether you agree with him or not, he did mediated 8 wars. Of the 8, 2 wars, 2 military conflicts broke out very close to China. One is the Cambodia and Thailand. You see, Trump, I attended a dinner in honor of the Thai foreign minister last month. And he said, we asked him, how US intervened. And the Thai foreign minister said, Donald Trump just called the Thai prime minister saying, you got to stop the war or I'm going to apply the tariffs. And then the Thailand back off. So presumably he did the same thing with Cambodia. So the point I want to make is that did China try? Yes, China tried. China merely sent China's foreign minister Wang Yi to meet with the Thai prime minister, the Thai foreign minister, and Cambodian foreign minister. China tried to mediate, but did not play a leadership role. But I'm telling you, if Xi Jinping, if our leader made the same call to the Cambodian prime minister and the Thai prime minister, he would have trimmed the same effect. Why he didn't make that call? something for you to think about. The second war that Trump claimed to have ended is the military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And both countries are members of the Shanghai Organization, which is headed by China. And I haven't read any reports about China's efforts in mediating the conflict, even though those two conflicts occurred much closer to China. So what does this tell you? From my limited understanding, I think China still wants to focus on its own domestic issues. China still wants to focus on growing the economy. So that comes to the next question, because in China, there were lots of narrow-minded nationalists believing now is the time for China to step up and becoming the leader of the global South. I don't think China is willing, nor is capable to step up and to play that leadership role. I mean, even in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? And that comes to the second part of the question you mentioned about how do I see the bilateral relationship between China and the United States moving forward. And it's happened this morning. The US ambassador to China, Perdue, he was also giving a speech at the Goldman Sachs conference, and I was there. It seemed to me that, the one thing he said, he was very optimistic about 2026, and he, as is widely reported, that the two leaders, China and the US, are going to meet 4 times. That Trump is coming to China in April, and Perdue said this morning that Xi Jinping is likely to visit US either in summer and autumn, and then the two leaders are supposed to meet on the sidelines of APEC in Shenzhen and the G20 in the US. So right now, Perdue said, China and the US are seriously talking over many issues. And another observation I want to make is something that I said in the same forum last year, predicting the trajectory of the China-US relationship. And some of you may not be here, so I want to use this again. I mean, because soon after sort of Donald Trump launched the first trade war against China in 2018, and I was constantly asked how to characterize the future relationship between Beijing and Washington. And I racked my brains, and I came up with this 8 words in Chinese, which is a sort of idiomatic phrase in Chinese, but I find it very difficult to translate into English. So I'm saying it in Mandarin first, and then I'll do a direct literary translation. In 2018, as I'm sticking to that analysis now, which is, I believe, the ties between Washington and Beijing will be like this in Mandarin, 8 words. 打打谈谈，谈谈打打, which means fighting, fighting, talking, talking, to be followed by fighting, fighting, and talking, talking. So right now, we're in the stage of talking, making deals. So from now, the China-US relationship will be very stable. I think they are working on kind of deals, but exactly whether that deal will cover Taiwan or will cover chips, we don't know. But then, trust me, after this talking is over, and there will be another round of fighting, and to be followed by talking. And this will be like what the China-US relationship will be like.
An endless cycle.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add a parenthesis comment on the so-called 8 conflicts that Donald Trump has said he solved? I've been spending a little bit more time in Thailand. You talk to the experts there, and they will tell you that, yeah, Donald Trump tried to force this. I guess it was the APEC meeting in Malaysia. But you'll notice both parties call it more of a memorandum of agreement rather than a ceasefire agreement. And to give credit to Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, he played a big role in this as well. Things are a bit calm right now, but the way it was explained to me, there's an incentive for Thailand to keep the embers cool right now. Why? Because they're having an election shortly. Yeah. And you cannot have an election in Thailand unless all districts are accessible to voting. Finally, the Armenian leader spoke at UN Week in New York and really hit us when he called that agreement also memorandum of understanding. So finally, we need not even remind you of what's going on in Gaza. I remember the other day at the Davos summit where Donald Trump unveiled this incredible board of peace. Jared Kushner went up there and said, yeah, we've ticked all the boxes. 100% food security in Gaza. And there's overabundance, these are his words, and he said the prices are going down. Well, I just checked yesterday and there's nowhere even close to that. So finally, Ukraine, he claims they're close to solving that. And he likes to say he triples at least the amount of money that he says Biden gave to Ukraine for arms. It's a lot lower than what he says. And the other thing is we have to remember in Trump 1.0, it was him who gave Ukraine the first offensive weapons, the Javelin missiles to Ukraine, not the previous administration. So when he says I've never started a war, we have to question that.
I agree.
Staying on Europe and Ukraine and Davos, we talked about the Canadian Prime Minister's speech, which was incredibly well received, and there were a number of European leaders as well who didn't mince words. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever said Europe is at a crossroads with the US and now has to make a choice between being a happy vassal or a miserable slave. And Xiang Wei made the point that there's this talk that middle powers need to band together, but there isn't much of a roadmap. Michael, where do you think Europe goes from here? And is NATO in danger of collapsing? And what would that look like? And what would that mean for conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza?
Well, first of all, it makes me very happy as a Canadian when my prime minister makes headlines for something other than dating a movie star. That's a good day for Canada. But yeah, that speech was very interesting. Number one, though, and I'll get to NATO in a second, we have to remember that Mark Carney is in power because he got the Trump bump, just like the leader of Australia right now. I checked today, I was sitting with you, and there is a double-digit spread between him and the opposition Conservatives a few weeks before the election in Canada last year. And then Canadians realized, oh my goodness, we need someone strong, elbows up, we better get Carney in there. But he can say all he wants about, we have to be more independent. Oh, and really, Mark Carney, the rules-based international orders and free fall, didn't know that, but I'll note it down. But anyway, look, we all have to recognize, and this goes to your point about what's going to happen to NATO, the EU is very, very fragmented at the moment, and that didn't start recently, that even happened during COVID. A lot of the electorate is leaning towards populist right parties, and financially a lot of countries are underwater. And as much as they would like to come to the aid of, for example, Ukraine, even more so, and backfill what the US is or is not going to give, they're not in a real position to do that. And I think if you look especially at the United Kingdom, there, as we see in many different jurisdictions, there are very, very deep, burning, competing domestic demands at home, healthcare system, deal with immigration, things like that. So the appetite for increasing military budgets at the moment is not very high. We had a panel at the Conduit Club in London, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and actually, you guys will remember the name Victor Mallet. He was there, and he said something that was true. He said back then, this was closer to the start of the war, because we're almost going into year 5 now. He said what the leaders should have done is put their people on a war footing and said things are going to get tough economically, because we have to devote more to defending Europe. They never did that, and that's part of the reason why we're in the mess right now. As for the future of NATO, I think their days are numbered. I think, I was told not to joke too much, but I think if Keir Starmer and the head of NATO butter up Trump anymore, calling him daddy or whatever, Trump's cholesterol level is going to go through the roof. But maybe that's the grand plan, I don't know. But I think what Zelensky, and especially the Baltic states, the frontline states to Russia are realizing is that we have to become more dependent of the United States, more codependent. Working to their benefit, this is a positive thing, is this war, I talked to you about the drones, has become very, very much a high-tech war. So sometimes the barrier to entry for offensive and defensive weapons is very, very low. Ukraine is blessed with a huge population of tech-savvy people. A lot of them are building their own drones. There's a huge domestic drone production now in Ukraine that even the United States is looking at, envious of that. And then these guys are also battle-hardened at the same time. A sanction to NATO is actually still in the Ukrainian constitution, but I have met nobody in Ukraine, anyone in Ukraine, who is really fixated on that. They would rather become parts of the EU sooner rather than later. And the other thing, this was a headline about 10 days ago, maybe none of you saw it, but Maia Sandu, the Prime Minister of Moldova, very, very small state, sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine, said the other day, it's becoming tougher and tougher and tougher for us to defend ourselves, even though we're on NATO's front line. And we benefit from their training and advice. And she said, very controversially, if it came to a referendum on us rejoining Romania, I would probably vote for it. First time I've pretty much heard a head of a nation saying I would vote for the dissolution of my state. But that is how bad things are right now with Russia's aggression. So to kind of wrap up, I think you're going to see these states that are on the front lines have their own kind of coalitions. Maybe they're going to take weapons from you, partners, perhaps from China and others, to arm themselves. Problem there, of course, is China is also reported to be supporting Russia in its war. One last point. I believe, speaking of leaders talking to each other, I still believe, and I might have said that when we did our Ukraine talk here, if Xi Jinping today or tomorrow called Putin and said, enough is enough, stop it, I think he would, because think about it, Russian forces right now are concentrated very, very heavily on the front line with Ukraine. They've taken enormous losses, huge, huge problems. The Russian Far East, very, very exposed. China, as you know, looks many, many years ahead. Putin knows that. So, yeah, I think that's the one call that would make a difference right now, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
How are people in Ukraine doing?
So, we talked about this a bit earlier. There's a lot of, since the start of the war, deserved PR about how resilient Ukrainians are. I've been based in Odessa for most of the war, and I call this the city of heroes, the capital of entrepreneurial spirit in Ukraine, Odessa. It's a port city. People know how to make the best of it at the worst of times. But we have never seen anything like we have today. It is, and I don't say this lightly, I've worked in Gaza, I've worked in other disaster areas. It is a humanitarian catastrophe. I was shocked this morning when I went to the long-range weather forecast. We just had, it's ongoing right now, a cold snap in Ukraine. It wasn't as bad as was expected, minus 13, minus 14. In a few days from now, minus 20, minus 21. Well, at the same time, Russia is continuing its strikes, targeted strikes on critical infrastructure. I have friends, I have relatives in parts of Ukraine. They haven't had power for a few days now. And the problem is a lot of our cities are very old. So when the electricity goes out, the heating goes out, and the water goes out, 3 at a time. And it's very, very difficult to live in those circumstances. They have established a lot of so-called centers of invincibility where you can go and warm up, you can recharge your devices. But I see around me businesses closing down. They can't cope anymore. These are in Odessa. These are tough, tough, tough people who have really tried to make a go of it. And it's very sad and depressing to see that happen around you. You also have really for the first time, a lot of movers and shakers leaving, the people who actually run the economy. And then finally, and this is very difficult to illustrate on TV or whatever, but this kind of tearing of the social fabric, families being split apart, separations and divorces are at all-time high. You have millions of Ukrainians who are now been overseas for 4 years or so. Some of them already qualifying for citizenship soon in Germany and places like that. And this is another huge loss to Ukraine because there are now doubts on how many will actually come back. Finally, there's a little intricacy here that you should know is, of course, a lot of those who left, especially at the beginning, are male. A lot of them should not have left. And they fear that if they do come back, even if there's a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement, they will be criminally charged for breaking the martial law rules because they weren't supposed to leave. And also we have a problem, you ask how people are coping. A lot of my friends who own bars and restaurants saw a huge drop in business because men are afraid to go out because they may be picked up by the roving military police, documents checked, and you're taken right away. Something is out of order, you're taken right away, even if you have a health exemption, right away. There is right now almost 250,000 Ukrainian men, this is according to the new Minister of Defense, who are away on leave, not quite legally. So they've gone AWOL. So this war needs to be solved soon for the reasons I mentioned, but also resources to continue the fight as well on both those front lines. Thank you for asking that question. Thank you.
I want to talk a bit about US domestic news because it is something that everyone is following so closely right now. And the whole world has been watching how the Trump administration approaches immigration and the raids that are being carried out, especially in Minneapolis, where ICE agents have killed 2 US citizens in 2 weeks in full view of the public. Barbara, you've mentioned how this resonates with people in parts of Latin America who have experienced violence at the hands of their own government. How did those countries get through those periods in your experience, or what lessons or warnings do you think they can offer the United States?
Well, like I told you the other day, it's very saddening to see this, but on the other hand, we've seen it before somewhere else. And on many occasions, people suffering, it's not government violence, but state violence, are victims of regimes which have been funded by the United States too. So domestically, the US is suffering something they've inflicted on others in the past. And it's a very tricky situation because what does it take to notice this? A lot of other people have been taken by ICE, murdered by them. So it had to be this male nurse. The others matter too, you know? So part of my research specialism is studying ways that authoritarianism has been resisted creatively. So I can say that one of the lessons is that creativity is always there. There are always ways to express dissent. There are always ways to say, I don't agree with this. The impact resonates far beyond the community. It resonates internationally. There are also NGOs that can help, human rights observatories to call, and also that when people participate in protests, they have to isolate the elements who are creating riots. Many times, I cannot say all the time, many of these people are also police, or they could be ICE themselves. So it's very important that people who are protesting peacefully take care of this also peacefully. I'm not sure if there will be a solution to this in the US, but I participated in protests myself in my own country in 2011 during the students' movement. That was led by our current president, Gabriel Boric. Back then, I would have never imagined that those powerful protests will end up with the leader of the students being elected president. So that was a big surprise. But it also tells you of the power of speaking up, of saying something. When there were protests in Chile back in 2019, I was here in Hong Kong, and I was feeling it very deeply, that I was away from my country, and it's a political matter. So whenever there's something like this, you decide on which side of history you are. And I was very affected by what was happening. So what did I do? In my own world here in Hong Kong, I decided to write about it. These things need to be talked about. And what we were saying over dinner, this also felt to us like a therapy session. Yes. Like there's so much going on around the world right now that we need instances to talk about it. And there are many things that we're not saying. We haven't even mentioned Greenland, you know? There's so much going on that we cannot cope. We haven't talked about the consequences of COVID in our own lives, in our own communities, in our workspaces, in our cities, etc. So there is a lot of fatigue, I guess, about different things. But I would say that these things need to be talked about. It's the best way of dealing with it. Also, of course, if we feel too affected by it, we have to take a step back, not read the news for a few days, but then you have to go back to it because you have a commitment to truth, you feel a commitment to democracy, you feel a commitment to these things that your parents taught you, that your society taught you, and those things make the world a better place. So we have to keep fighting for them all the time. And I think that would be my message, that we have to keep committed to these things.
Yeah. That's so sad. Quick thing about NATO, there are so many balls in the air you forget, but I think a lot of you are familiar with Article 5 of NATO, attack against one member country is an attack against all. And you know, since the start of the war in Ukraine, there have been many, many stray missiles, stray drones that have fallen on NATO soil, in Romania, in Poland especially, hardly a peep. Those of you who are from the United Kingdom will be familiar with well, I don't know if you can call it panic, but when a Russian scientific ship or whatever was mapping out submarine cables off UK waters, and when RAF jets flew overhead, what did the Russians do, or the crew on board? They shone military-grade lasers into the eyes of RAF pilots. Russia's hybrid warfare is only going to get worse. But what is that trigger for Article 5? And Putin watches this very, very carefully. He prods for soft tissue until he finds it, and that's what he's finding. As for what's going on now, I'm not speaking as someone from the Atlantic Council, let's get it out of the way. But what does worry me is the rhetoric, the narrative that you hear coming from the White House and the Trump circle. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Civil War, but I've talked to American friends of mine, and it's not that we're getting dangerously close to that particular scenario, but when you hear terms used against Americans like the ICU nurse insurrectionist or domestic terrorist, the violations, and I don't think they're alleged violations of law, you know, not identifying yourself as a police officer, storming into houses and dragging people out, it reaches a very, very dangerous point. Last thing here, I was, again, in New York on UN Week, and there were two things that happened to me. Number one, it was the first time I ever entered the United States. And remember, I grew up, or spent a lot of my adult life in a border town. The first time where I wiped my phone clean pretty much because I was afraid that US immigration could go through it. I'm a little bit of a focus of attention. Fortunately, we have pre-clearance in Canada, so we still do this on Canadian soil. But the other thing that was shocking is that when we had 2 or 3 panel discussions similar to this one, right at the start, the moderator said, please everyone, Chatham House rules. We have people here representing Gaza, Palestine, Ukraine, and elsewhere. We don't want them to end on some State Department list, so it's going to be off the record. That's the type of atmosphere it was then, and it's only getting worse.
I'll note that this event is being recorded and will end up on YouTube, so it's freely available to anyone who wants to watch it. Xiangwei, did you have anything to add?
I'm very sorry to hear, what is happening about Ukraine. I think there has been lots of talk about, China needs to put more pressure on Russia to end the war. But I just give you the examples. And China did nothing about Thailand. China even did not try hard enough to end the military conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, because I think this is not the way China wants to do things, to become that leader. The second part about, I just want to sort of steal one thing Rishi Sunak said this morning, which sort of, I find it very interesting, just talking about Europe and the United States. He said 10 or 15 years ago, the size of the economy, the combined economy of EU, was more or less the same as the size of the economy in the United States. Now, 10 or 15 years later, the size of the US economy now is much bigger than the size of the combined economy of EU. And then if you say by crude math, if you make EU as the 51st or the 51st state of the United States, ahead of Canada, and the per capita income of the EU, if it is merged into the United States, will be the poorest state in the whole United States.
Wow.
Even poorer than Mississippi. I mean, don't look at me. This is from Rishi Sunak this morning. And so let's talk about the kind of states the Europe is in. And I mean, regarding, I'm not an expert on Europe. I can only say from a Chinese perspective, which is this, that for a long, long time, China was very keen for EU to become the third pillar of the world, to become an independent power. I mean, even though that independent power can counter China, but it can also counter the United States. But unfortunately, EU, just simply does not live up to the standard. As Michael mentioned earlier, I mean, the head of NATO still called Donald Trump the daddy. So this daddy complex, is still festering with EU. So I'm not quite sure what I can say more about Europe. So in the future, I'll focus on China-US relationship. Thank you.
One last question from me, and then I want to open it up to the audience. So with everything that's been going on, the relentless pace of news, especially from the US, a lot of issues have been pushed to the background. What's something that you think we're not talking about and should be paying more attention to in the world? Anyone is welcome to start. Climate change.
The climate crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And the Epstein files.
The Epstein files.
Yeah. And if I hear Donald Trump say one more time that they don't like wind farms in China, they hardly use them, well, sorry, but they're one of the leading world leaders. But
I believe it's home to the largest wind farm in the world.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So environment is a big one, and also related to environment, because we have to remember it's a trigger to migration. Migration is not going to stop tomorrow, no matter what they do in the United States. But because of what's happening in, I don't want to isolate, for example, Africa or whatever, but there are trouble spots all over the world. When you have nothing to eat, or when your house is bombed, and I mean, look what happened to Ukraine, the migration there. If things get worse in Ukraine, hard to imagine they can, I say this on air whenever I have the opportunity, is Europe, get ready for another outflow of people, because it's going to happen. So this, I'm sure for you as well, this anti-immigrant, anti-migration rhetoric is very, very troublesome, in the fact that it overlooks the fact that a lot of people do not leave by choice. They are forced to just just to survive. So, but yeah, it's very interesting that in Davos, even though Al Gore and people like that were there, environment was relegated to very low, if not at all.
Yeah, to me, the one thing that's, again, I have to talk about this sort of Goldman Sachs morning conference because I got lots by talking to people, is that when they talk about AI, when they talk about the AI future, and that reminds me, nobody now these days talk about the income disparity, how to help the poor people. Nobody's talking about that anymore. And then, they all, this morning, they talk about in the next few years, what are the hottest stocks to invest in? And they all sort of talking about military, the Western, the sort of armaments companies in Germany, South Korea, those are the things you're going to invest because you will see sort of partly because what Donald Trump is doing. Now, every country is investing in defense. So that if you want to make some money, defense stock is something you need to buy. That's one takeaway I get from the Goldman Sachs conference this morning.
All right, well, let's open it up to questions. We've got microphones that we'll pass around, and yeah, we can start over here.
Thank you so much for sharing all the insights. I have a few questions for Latin America. Do you think the countries with left-wing governments, for example, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, do they feel under threat because post-Venezuela event? And the question to Ukraine, do you think how long would the situation still stay, really sadly? And to Xiangwei, what's the probability for you to see, the tail risk or the volatile situation of Taiwan Strait this year? The people have been talking about this a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. I think in relation to what's been said about Latin America from the Trump administration, I think if there is a next target to talk in these terms is Cuba. That would be the next one, because then Venezuela is already being blocked from sending resources to Cuba. And Marco Rubio is very interested in doing something about that, about Cuba. He's a descendant of Cuban people who left the country prior to the revolution, so they are very deeply anti-communist in the Cuban sense. With Colombia, it's mostly been in terms of arguments between Petro and Donald Trump. I think, I don't remember when Colombia has the next elections, but I think it's fairly soon because it started in 2022. So maybe they will go back to a more moderate government and maybe things will smooth out a little bit. Petro's government also is not very popular. And as I have said before, it's the first left-leaning government that Colombia have had almost in their entire history. So they've been mostly moderate and pro-US. So I don't think I don't want to say I anticipate any sort of conflict there. Brazil is farther south, and they're pretty independent in their approach, even though Lula da Silva is a left-leaning president. But I'm not sure, has Donald Trump threatened Brazil yet? Or I don't recall.
Well, Lula has gone on his own pretty much, I think, and said, screw you, Donald Trump.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of their own way of dealing with this. Mexico is always going to be contentious because they're a border country, right? But I think the current president has been very pragmatic and trying to keep the relationship working out for both sides. But I think Donald Trump will keep threatening tariffs to everybody. But on the other hand, I think there will be a tariff fatigue from everyone else who's been receiving these tariff threats. So, okay, so what does this mean? And again, how can I avoid these tariffs? How can I deal with this? Can I negotiate with somebody else, etc.? I think Mexico is the most dependent country on the U.S., so they have to remain more or less in a calm position. But I wouldn't say that Donald Trump seems eager to start invading them like what happened with Venezuela. I think it sets a very bad precedent anyway. But the argument against Maduro about the legitimacy of the government is not an argument that can be used for the other countries. I will say arguably except Cuba, depending on how you look at it. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Regarding Taiwan, two things are happening which will help reduce the tensions over Taiwan this year. First is, as I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are going to meet 4 times this year. And if you watch China-US relationship as closely as I do, so far, US side has refrained from saying anything which will anger China, particularly over Taiwan. And as Purdue said this morning, US and China are working closely to make sure there is something to be announced in Trump's upcoming visit to China in April, despite the Chinese New Year is coming. So they have a very short window to talk over things. And secondly, Trump, I'm not quite sure you have noticed, Trump has said several times in interviews with the US media organizations, he said Xi Jinping assured him several times that Beijing is not going to invade Taiwan when Trump is the president, when he is the president. And China has never publicly acknowledged this, but Trump said this several times. And the third reason is this. As you know, I was sort of worried that Jennifer will ask that question, that over the weekend, China's top 2 military generals were purged, which means over the past 3 years, almost every top general in charge of every discipline of China's armed forces have been purged. So if I think there is one ridiculous line of reasoning among certain overseas Chinese bloggers suggesting the reason that this purges are going on is because he wants to get rid of all those generals who are opposed of invading Taiwan. I'm not quite sure that line sort of stands. If you have all the top generals being replaced, and then it exposes some issue with this chain of command. If the chief of staff who's in charge of drawing our military plan was changed, so that will say, I think this latest developments coming out of China over the PLA sort of suggest the chances that there will be any kind of a military conflict over Taiwan has been sharply reduced instead of increasing. That's my 2 cents.
I think the only 2 people left in the military's top leadership now are President Xi and the head of his anti-corruption campaign. 2 out of 7. Is that right?
Jennifer is right. In October 2022, following the 20th Party Congress, the party leadership elected a 7-member for the Central Military Commission. CMC is China's highest body in charge of military, with Xi Jinping as the chairman. There were 7. Now, 3 years later, only 2 people remain. One is Xi Jinping, the other guy is Zhang Xinmin, who was recently promoted, who had little combat experience, who is now in charge of anti-corruption at PLA. Only 2 in charge of the whole ministry?
Did you have a
The
question
Ukraine,
as well?
yeah.
Right?
Well, it's the $1 million question when the war in Ukraine will end. But I can tell you one thing, let's get something out of the way. It's not going to end because of Donald Trump. I think, like many things, it's very complicated, a lot of balls in the air. I'll try to keep it short. But we also have the phenomenon right now of Mr. Zelensky being more politically weak domestically than he ever has been. And I would also argue that even sympathy or attention for the war in Ukraine has really declined for a number of reasons. But the political unity that used to exist at the beginning of the war is almost not there anymore, because a big reason is because of these enormous corruption scandals. The $100 million corruption scandal from a few weeks ago, where money was siphoned off by these slobs, these people right in his circle, money that was earmarked to protect nuclear power plants from Russian aggression. So you cannot blame the average Ukrainians, and I talk to a lot of them every day. They are now drawing a direct line, and very fairly, from their current troubles or problems of no water, no heating, and no electricity to that particular scandal. Because things might have been a little bit better by now if that had never happened. And not only that, there's another scandal now in Parliament of people accepting bribes. So this is really her Zelensky. In my inaugural New York Times editorial last year, we actually posed the question, is Zelensky out of his depth? He may be very good on the international stage. He's been very, very much lionized. But domestically, things are not looking good. And if he's forced, look, he also said, by the way, that he's a one-term president. I'm not so sure about that anymore. But he may be forced into a corner by Russia to hold elections on a very, very fast, or very short time frame. That would be a disaster. The Russians would target polling stations. The Central Election Commission hasn't been in operation since before the war. The infrastructure just isn't there. And by the way, how do you get 7 million Ukrainians living overseas to vote when most Ukrainian embassies are not only scarce, but they're hugely under-resourced? Also, the other thing, I can tell you, I visit, because it's part of my job and I feel committed to it so much, is I visit war cemeteries as much as I can. We have a new one in Odessa, and most of them are reaching capacity. So when this idea of territorial swap comes up, and that's a key part of the Russian negotiating strategy, they want to take control of all 4 oblasts, which they only partially control. When this comes up, Ukrainians are rightfully asking, why did our sons and daughters die? Why did they shed so much blood? So he is in a very tough position, but I hate to say this, the things are reaching, again, I call it a humanitarian disaster, and I don't use that term lightly once again, but things are reaching a breaking point. And, you know, where is the international community? Where is the pressure on Russia? Where day after day after day, I mean, these are war crimes targeting civilian infrastructure that provide heating, power, and water. Finally, there's some strange relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. We can't really figure it out. I don't know if anyone can, but he will say one thing to Zelensky one day, or to the head of NATO or whoever, and say, yeah, we've agreed to this. Putin will call him up and say, none of those powerful missiles for Ukraine, it's a bad idea. And the next day, Trump will go back on what he promised Ukraine. To see the way Trump elevated Putin from literally the diplomatic grave, international diplomatic grave in Alaska, in what I called a circus on air, where Putin was given the red carpet, rode in the US presidential beast mobile, given first, it seemed like a summit that was scripted from beginning to end by the Kremlin, including no questions in the press conference, by the way. So until that happens, and as long as the United States is the main guarantor of security to Ukraine, it's very difficult to answer your question, but it must end soon and not on Russia's terms.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Can we hear some views on what the panel may think about the American armada now steaming towards Iran, given that the Iranian government has recently been responsible for the deaths of 40,000 Iranian people?
Yes, we haven't really gotten into Iran tonight. So
I don't have anything. That's sorry.
The only thing I'll say about this, and it also applies to what has been going on in Venezuela, the US strikes in northern Nigeria, is I thought Trump was elected by his MAGA base to focus on home. No more world policemen, enough is enough. Let's focus on things at home. Trump can hardly make the argument even, you know better than this, about drugs from Venezuela are killing, thousands or tens of thousands of Americans. No, it's not. It's maybe a bit of a transit point. Or about these so-called migrant terrorists, or sorry, not migrants, but these terrorists on the waters that we have to blow out of the water. So to make that argument to the American public on why the U.S. needs to, let's call it intervention in Iran, is a hard one, I think. It would be interesting to hear their justification. Sure, they can argue for perhaps about shipping lanes, Red Sea, very, very important. Iranians have a bit of reach there. But I am wondering if we're getting to that breaking point among the U.S. public as, hey, his MAGA base, this isn't what we elected you for. Focus on the problems at home, of which there are many.
I'm not familiar with the Iran situation, except for the fact that I started to watch the Tehran season 3, that excellent Israel-made TV series.
Yeah,
I'll
great.
strongly recommend anyone who wants to watch it. Thank you.
And it points to Israeli involvement and the presence in Iran. Don't think it's not there. So, yeah.
Yeah, we got a question over here.
Yes, hello. A question, Houghton Lee. I mean, for Mr. Wang, for Xiangwei. I agree. You said there'll be a lot of conspiracy theory flowing around the overseas Chinese community, especially among those YouTube KOL, regarding the purge of so many generals. Okay, you don't think that because you just said that. Then, but what is the real reason behind all these quite rapid purges of so many generals in such a short time? What's the take? What's the explanation of why this happened in the first place? Thank you.
Thank you. To put things into context, I'll give you a multi-choice question. Since 2022, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which army has lost the most senior generals? A, Russia. B, Ukraine. C, the United States. D, China. It's a trick question. I'm joking. I think since 2022, when the party elected the new leadership of the top military, so far up to, it depends on who you talk to, so far up to 28 or 29 generals were removed, purged, or disappeared from the public view. But if you Google, if you use AI, X, or any AI to check how many generals have been forced to retire or demoted or sacked from the United States military forces since Donald Trump came to power again for the second term in January last year, 24. So the reason I'm saying this is all about loyalty. The reason that Trump and his war secretary are purging the US forces, the same reason that Xi Jinping is doing what he's doing with the PLA. loyalty. So whatever the reason you read about, even some suggestion that the top military guy was detained because he was accused of leaking nuclear weapon secrets to the United States. I'm not really buying that, because according to the people who were briefed about the reasons for their downfall, that part of it never came up. But maybe it came out at a very, very high level, which I'm not familiar with. According to my friends who were briefed about this, the part about that he was accused of leaking nuclear weapon secrets was not there. So if you sort of put this into this context, I think it's all about loyalty, that he, the leader sort of believe those people are not loyal enough. And it maybe it's not a fair comparison, but in the United States, if you follow the US military news, Trump and Hegseth are doing the same thing with the US military forces. And the rest about corruption, yeah, I mean, I can tell you that, most of the generals they are corrupt. So if they use that to go after and those people are guilty.
Yeah, but sorry, I just cut you at that. Okay, I understand. I agree with your point. You're great about your observation. But most of the generals, the US generals demoted by Trump, were promoted by Biden or Obama. But in China, most of these generals had been promoted by the supreme leader himself. And then he purged them. I mean, it's all over my head.
That's an excellent question, which I want you to go back to the Communist Party history. When Mao Zedong was alive, right, from 49 to 76 until the year he died, he was China's supreme leader. And all the top generals fought with him from the early years of Red Army, fighting the Japanese, fighting the KMT. They were all loyal to Chairman Mao. And if you are familiar with that part of history, more often have those generals purged for no reason whatsoever. All those generals were loyal to him. So if you are someone high up, I think the variables you consider are much different from you and me, the mere mortals. I think that you could argue that all the generals who disappeared were promoted by him, but then again, later on the loyalty issue comes up, and then these things happen. I'm sorry, I cannot say more. Otherwise, I'll get myself into trouble.
I think we have time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. There's, okay, let's, yes, Ms. Lau, and then we'll finish up in the back there.
Thank you. I want to ask Michael a question about Canada.
Sure. Oh, hi.
I love Canada. I think Canada is great. So given the current difficulties, and now we hear about Alberta asking for independence, and some people are traveling under, minus 50 degree to go to Ottawa from Toronto to protest. So what's happening? Do you think many Canadians are upset with Carney? You think Carney's going to be thrown out? You think the Canadians are going to vote to join the United States? What's going to happen to Canada? Thank you.
Yeah. Emily, right? Emily?
Yeah.
Yeah. Emily used to encourage me when I was at the South China Morning Post to get the story out there and don't let the editor suppress you too much. Look, I will answer your question, I promise, but to give you an idea of how quickly things change and perceptions change, in War Briefing the other day, in the span of 12 hours, we had two news cartoons, editorial cartoons. The first one was when Carney was just leaving China, and signed a whole raft of deals, mostly economic deals. Human rights didn't come up that much, I don't think. But one of the big ones there was the car deal. And I've seen with my own eyes in Asia and also in Europe how much BYD, right, the big one, has penetrated. Unbelievable. And the Uber drivers here brag about the charging power and how far they can go. So this is a big deal for Canada because we rely very much on the auto market, and it really upset Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario. So anyway, the editorial cartoon was, be careful how tightly you embrace the Chinese panda because you may be left with scratches. A few hours later, after Trump uttered his statement about it's no big deal, I knew by his word and his posture that it was a big deal and he's going to come down on Canada, which he did. And then we redid it where the beaver and the panda are actually in a kind of almost romantic embrace, but with a very menacing US eagle over them looking down enviously. So that's the position, I think, what was going to happen to Canada. It's reevaluating all of its relationships. India is going to be next, I think. And I don't have to remind you, is that one of the big reasons that we fell into hot water with China, remember the name Meng Wanzhou, Huawei, CFO of Huawei? Canada, being the goody two-shoes that we are, stopped her in Vancouver Airport on a US warrant. We could have let the Mexicans do it, or we could have let her go on her way back to Hong Kong, but we didn't because we're polite and we're loyal. And that created a lot of problems. It spun out, the two Michaels, things like that. And also with India as well. Things are in a mess right now, but they're going to get better because of, let's just call it Indian interference on Canadian soil. So I don't think, I think if anything, we're moving away from any type of becoming the 51st state of the United States. That's the last thing Canadians want. And I would argue even in Alberta as well. Definitely not Quebec, because they're already worried about being a French-speaking island in the middle of North America. Union with the US would make that even more challenging for them. But the problem is that in Alberta, we have an Albertan, fellow Albertan here, is that there's a big worry that the United States, now having gained access to Venezuelan oil again, could cut Alberta off, and that would be disastrous for not only the Alberta economy, but also Canadian economy because of the huge transfer payments. I spoke to or listened to an analyst who say if that were to be cut off, give Canada about 5 years to be on its economic knees. So that's why, yes, we are big. Look, Carney still thinks Canada is a middle power. I'm not so sure because we, for example, lost our bid. It was very humiliating for a rotating position on the UN Security Council. We've closed embassies abroad. We've cut development aid all over. That isn't the actions of a middle power. So we have limited maneuverability. Our dollar has plunged to record levels. We've had to, well, when I say we, the government of Canada has had to really slash immigration. This will be familiar to people from the UK and Europe because the medical system can't cope anymore. It's falling apart. Social services are falling apart. So that whole kind of character, Canadian character, needs to be reevaluated. Yes, we will stick to our principles, but at the same time, we have to remain economically viable. We see these threats to Greenland, and for the first time ever, we do feel that we could be next. So it's a very depressing time, but I think the one thing that gives me hope when I talk about Canada is that we're pretty much unified, even in Alberta, which has had some kind of talk about separatism, problems with Quebec, that we're very, very unified, and we will stand up, and we will never allow a bully to bully us. And we will not allow that bully to take things away from us that are ours. For example, we have a lot of water, and we have a huge Arctic. We have access to very strategic shipping lanes that are now becoming open for the first time ever. But we will never become submissive to a bully like that.
Very good.
Yeah.
And we had a last question in the very back.
Yeah, thank you for that response. As an American, I just want to say thank you for standing up to a bully, because my question is, we started the night off with Prime Minister Carney going to Beijing and setting up trade deals, and the idea that other European leaders are going to be following in sync. My question is this a long-term geopolitical relational break between Europe, Canada, and America? Or is this more of a short-term, and I know this isn't the best analogy, but when there's a spat between the parents and the child, and the child goes and starts dating the person who you know is going to really piss off mom and dad, but as soon as they make up, they come back home. Is this a more permanent breach, or is this something short-term that after Trump can be reconciled?
I guess in the old days, as a Canada or any other country, you used to be able to fall back on the WTO or rules-based international order and say, hey, that bully over there is using his tariff baton to do things we don't want to do. But that world-based international order is in free fall. I'm not bragging about World Briefing, but yesterday in World Briefing, we had a lead piece about how Russia has manipulated Interpol to go after opponents all over the world and get them hauled back to Russia. That some of these institutions, credit to my friend here for putting this phrasing, but also credit to institutions which we built and tried to hardwall against manipulation are now being used in some regard against us. So that is the big problem right now. And that's why I go back to something I said earlier, is that we need to review our friendships, our alliances. There's one thing wartime teaches you, is who your best friends are. But, and we need to, I was with Pretty, my editorial right hand, and her sister who were here at the G20 in South Africa. And the one thing we observed very curiously there was how the South African leader told the Americans to piss off after they said, we're boycotting the G20, you've been bad to us, and we want you to hand over the G20 because the US is taking over it. And the South Africans said, no, if you want it, you come here physically. And then they tried to send a charge, and the South Africans said, enough is enough. The reason it sounds like a small example, but there are others as well, is that this is creating a kind of coalition of the unwilling. We can throw probably Lula Brazil in there, a few others, that are standing up and saying enough is enough. And I think if that you get enough traction there, if you get a critical mass of countries who can punish or push the United States in a certain way, things could change for the better for these vulnerable countries. I think actually that is the only way. We're not, like Ukraine, we're not looking to the EU for salvation. But it's very, very politically risky for someone like Carney, because Trump has already threatened, what was it, 100% tariffs for this trade deal with China. It's not actually a trade deal, but it was a series of agreements. But if you're going to use that bully tariff baton to force countries into submission, you need to think really, really quickly. Again, finally, the problem is things don't change overnight. You can't flip the switch and say, okay, we're going to do all our trade with China, or more trade with China, or we're going to start selling LNG to Europe. We don't even have the terminals on our East Coast to be able to do that. We should by now, but we don't. So I hope that helps answer.
Can I just offer a perspective as a Chinese analyst? What is happening between Trump, U.S., and EU, Canada, whoever he's targeting, with the U.S. allies. My reading is this. You see, right now in China, as I mentioned earlier, some nationalists are very excited about this, saying that now they're looking for a kind of a permanent break between the U.S. and its Western allies. I'm not that naive or what I believe from a Chinese perspective, what is happening between Trump, the U.S., and his Western allies is something that when I was a kid, we were educated, that was the waning years of Mao Zedong, and we were educated to look at things in two ways. One is the contradiction among people, 人民内部矛盾. The other is the contradiction, antagonistic contradiction, which is 敌我矛盾. So if you read, my reading is the contradiction, right now what is happening between US and its European allies in Canada is still a contradiction among the members of the same family. I think it can be repaired. That has not reached the antagonistic contradiction, which means with enemies, they have become enemies. I don't think, we have gone that far, even though some leftist views in China is believing that is heading that way. That's my take.
I hope you're right, because I have not heard from many Americans, leave Canada alone. Donald Trump, don't do this. It's been kind of disappointing that way, I must say. So.
I just want to end on one final question. And Michael, you talked about what gives you hope when it comes to the situation in Canada. We've talked about a lot of things tonight that are quite depressing, and we've talked about how people can feel overwhelmed and want to turn off the news and disengage. What's something that gives you hope or that you feel positive about in the news or in the world that keeps you going? Who would like to start?
The passing of time.
Yeah.
What you can call an act of God. And also I have big faith in younger generations. I'm a scholar, I work at university, I deal with people who are between 18 and all ages really. And I feel really hopeful when I hear their opinions in class, how idealism is still important, how we nurture young people to think for themselves. There was mention of AI. Yes, I see that there is a brain rot tendency there. But on the other hand, we can fight against it, so I feel hopeful because we have young people, we have idealism, and because of that, I think we have a future. And the other thing I want to say is that, yes, we talk about the US as a bully, but on the other hand, who's really the bully? There's a humane point to that. I don't think every American is a bully. I don't think every American is represented by the bully. And I think that's the big wound in American society right now. And I think about it from the perspective of my own country, Chile, that's been divided politically for more than 50 years now. And it's an open wound. And there is a wound in American society that didn't start now. It's for many, many, many years. But that now it needs to find its point of reckoning, I guess. So let's hug and let's cherish our American friends, especially the ones who are vocally against this.
I've become such a cynic, I had to go to Pretty, a member of the younger generation, and ask her what she thought about what to be optimistic about. But I really do think that when we look at the very, very rapid evolution of things like citizen journalism, open source reporting, especially in places like Iran, where these thugs think they can block off information by turning off the internet, or in Uganda, Museveni turning off the internet. Well, sorry guys, technology has evolved where you can use Starlink and other methods to get your word out. So this is a really, really important development. I think it's only going to get bigger in this year and in years to come, where they can no longer unilaterally control the flow of information.
And pivotal in the US as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially with what's happening in Minnesota. Also, support to media outlets, Minnesota, Star Tribune, things like that. Donations have poured in at this very, very crucial time. The other thing I'd say, we haven't talked much about Africa, but again, we were at the G20. By the way, we're going to have more narrow panel focused on Africa tomorrow night, if anyone's interested, and the table right there. What we saw also, not only from the summit itself, but talking to a lot of Africans, is this kind of really optimistic self-assurance that we're now have begun to really, in a big way, cut our commercial ties, our restrictive commercial ties with our former colonial masters, diamonds, coffee, natural resources, rare earth minerals processed right here in Africa. We're not going to use the US currency any longer as a go-between currency. We're going to trade amongst ourselves. A lot of work to be done on that. But the fact that they're talking about it, the fact that they're saying they can do it, and it's going to make a huge change. And I think despite what happened in Uganda with Museveni, president for life, there's new, younger people coming up that is going to give this continent with such amazing hope a lot of promise. So that makes me sleep better at night.
I share Barbara's hope. She's teaching at Hong Kong U. I'm teaching at Hong Kong BU. I think teaching, as a journalist of more than 30 years, I want to pass on my skills and how to write and report on China, which is one of the most important stories, but it's also, meanwhile, it's also one of the most difficult stories to write about. And personally, I hope the AI bubble will burst this year so that I can buy some AI stocks. I missed that trade. So that's it. Thank you.
And
Yep.
30 seconds, I don't mean to sound like a salesman, but speaking of COVID and optimism, things like that, we have my book, Digital Pandemic. There's a special FCC price of $150, and also Cards for War briefing, where we try to connect the geopolitical dots so you don't have to, but as much as possible, and I make this pledge to you to bring forth more positive stories. I think that's something that's been lacking, so discount for that tonight too, big one.
Yeah, it's a great book available
you.
over there, Digital Pandemic. Thank you all so much. And Barbara, I wanted to say thank you for making the distinction between America as a government and America as a people. We appreciate it. Hug your American friends. And thank you all so much again for coming. Let's give them a round of applause.
Good. Well done.
We have some gifts for you.
Oh, great.
And thank you all again for coming. One quick note, if you enjoyed this event tonight and you are not a member of the FCC, you are welcome to apply. You do not have to be a journalist. So talk to me, talk to anyone on the staff if you would like to pick up an application. And if you are a member and you know someone who should be a member, put an application in their hands. If they join, there's a $2,000 F&B credit for you. Everybody wins.
Wow.
And hope to see you at our upcoming events. And thank you again, and have a great night.